Central banking has had a massive impact on the world, and not just the economy. Believe it or not, central banks are one of the main reasons for the massive and destructive wars that seem to go on forever. No matter how these wars turn out, the bankers always win and the people always lose. Let's get it.
I'm not a financial advisor.
So even Adam Smith, in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, pointed out, he said that wars would be less frequent and shorter if they were financed by taxes. And he was really expressing this idea that Buchanan called fiscal illusion, that they make the perceived cost of war lower, and everything else, not just war. The Fed, when it was created in 1913, it financed about a fourth of World War I. And so there might not have been American participation in World War I had it not been the Fed in existence. And of course, the income tax came in also at the same time. And the top rate went from, it was originally 7%, and it went to 77% because there was an emergency, after all, the war, as far as it never did go back down to 7%.
Welcome to the channel. I'm your host, The BitBoy. And today, we are getting deep. If you want your political, financial, and historical IQs to increase, you need to watch this entire video. In this series, we're taking a look at The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin and going through the big lessons from the book. Today, we're going to explore Griffin's research showing that most of the major wars we've been involved with, at least a century, have been instigated by bankers who had a lot to gain. Griffin called this the new alchemy because the bankers were turning lead bullets into gold, like the old stories where the alchemists in the Middle Ages turned lead into gold. He also makes a very good point about how the power to print money has encouraged governments to go to war even if they can't afford it. Without the ability to endlessly print money, the governments of the world would not be able to fund the constant wars that they've been getting involved in for the past century. When you really look into it, you start to see what the global banking system really is. Griffin really has a way with words with the new alchemy term I just mentioned. He used the mandrake mechanism, which describes how money is printed out of thin air. And even the title of the book itself, The Creature from Jekyll Island, really paints a picture of the kind of evil that he's trying to describe. Well, in the book, he introduces another concept. We'll call it the both children formula. Technically, it's a bit different in the book. It's named after the famous banking family, but it's best that robots don't hear me saying their name. But if you've been keeping up, you should know who I'm talking about. This formula describes how the both children and the other powerful banking families have used wars to expand their power and control over governments and economies. Wars are extremely profitable for bankers, especially when they can finance both sides of the conflict. By financing both the winners and the losers, bankers guarantee that they will always win. And even if they can't be repaid by the losers, they'll keep the country in debt and then still make enough in interest from the winners to make a profit. This tactic not only generates massive profits, but also places both sides in debt, which increases the influence that bankers have over governments. Wars are expensive, and countries usually need to take out massive loans to finance their military campaigns. The both children formula keeps governments indebted long after the war is over, while they continue to pay interest on the loans they took out. Once a country is in debt, its government becomes dependent on bankers to stay above water, and then the bankers can call the shots. Struggling to stay updated on the latest crypto news and trends? It's easy to miss crucial updates in the fast-paced crypto world. Subscribe to our new newsletter, NWF Weekly Report. Get the latest insights, trends, and tips delivered straight to your inbox. Sign up today. From the perspective of the banking elite, wars are opportunities to profit from lending money to governments, selling weapons, and funding reconstruction efforts. There are actually a lot of examples of this throughout history, and Griffin lays out some of the biggest ones in this book. One of the most famous examples of the both children formula happened during the Napoleonic Wars. According to Griffin, the both children family financed both the British and the French during the conflict, ensuring that they would profit regardless of the outcome. After the war, the countries owed massive debts to the both children family, which was a major turning point for the banking dynasty. World War I is another example of the both children formula in action. The war was financed by massive borrowing from central banks, which were controlled by the banking elite. But this time, they were unable to fund both sides of the war. They had mostly funded the Allies. There's also a lot of evidence pointing to the fact that the bankers instigated the war and allowed for a ship to be attacked to pull the United States into the war. Griffin dedicates an entire chapter to the sinking of the Lucitania ship. And let me tell you, this is one of my favorite chapters. It was very interesting. When the First World War began, the United States was officially neutral, but powerful financial interests, especially the both children family and their friends at JP Morgan in the US, had a lot riding on the war. Now keep in mind, when you hear JP Morgan, That's a British family. JP Morgan was more for the British than he even was for the United States. JP Morgan could have lost billions if the Allies lost. And the Bowes-Children family were closely connected with the Morgans. They desperately wanted to bring the US into the war on the side of the Allies to ensure that their loans were going to be repaid. This new alliance would tip the balance in favor of the Allies and increase their chances of victory and protect the financial investments of American bankers. On May 7, 1915, the Lucitania, a British passenger ship, was torpedoed and sunk by a German boat off the coast of Ireland. Nearly 1,200 passengers and crews didn't make it, including 128 Americans who were on board. The attack caused outrage in the United States and generated a lot of support for the war against Germany. Now, 3 years later, it's widely recognized that even though the Germans did attack the ship, it was secretly carrying weapons, which did make it a valid target. And US and British officials apparently sent it and the citizens into harm's way, knowing there was a good chance it could get attacked. Why would they allow their own people to be attacked, though? Because they knew it would be the only way to drum up support for the war? I mean, surely we haven't seen that in recent times. I don't think they were doing it back then, right? Winston Churchill, who later became prime minister, was in charge of the British Navy at the time. He intentionally sent the ship into harm's way and refused to send a naval escort. And then he never warned the ship about incoming enemy ships, even though they were known to be in the area. In the book, Griffin cited a memo that Churchill wrote before the sinking of the Lusitania, where he said, "It is most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores, in the hope especially of embroiling the United States with Germany."
You know, I mentioned mysteries. One of the great mysteries, of course, is, and as you document, the British well knew that submarines were in the area. They were tracking this.
Not only did they know that submarines were there, they knew that this submarine, U-20, was very likely to be in that area because they knew exactly where it was headed.
But they didn't send out naval patrol to guard the Lusitania.
Well, nor did they tell Captain Turner, who was the captain of the Lusitania, nor did they tell him that any of this was known. I mean, they knew precisely the patrol zone that this submarine was going to be in off Liverpool, which is where all the Cunard ships were headed. They also knew that Knightley, the big German broadcasting center at Norddeich, was broadcasting the Lusitania's comings and goings.
Why didn't they tell them? Why didn't they do more? Was there, in fact, some sense for the British wanting a ship to go down to lure the Americans into the war?
It is a complicated story. Let me hang on one historian who, early on, when he wrote a book about the spy agency, the super secret spy entity in this book called Room 40, he concluded that the reason the Lusitania was allowed to sail into the Irish Sea unprotected was because of, it was just as he put it, it was a monumental cock-up. It was a mistake. Mm-hmm. Later in life, as other evidence came forward, he changed his mind, which I found fascinating. And there was this interview at the on file in the Imperial War Museum in London, where he says that, you know, as much as he loves the Royal Navy and he calls himself a lover of the Royal Navy, he had come to the conclusion at that point in his life that there was some kind of a conspiracy. There was something.
It's also important to remember who the President of the United States was at the time. That's right, Woodrow Wilson, same president that oversaw the establishment of the Federal Reserve, so you already know he was on the banker's payroll. It took almost 2 years of propaganda. But in April of 1917, President Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany and used the sinking of the Lusitania as one of the main reasons. When the Second World War broke out, the bankers were sure not to make the same mistake they made with the last one. They went back to their strategy of funding both sides. And this even included funding Germany during their darkest and most evil hours. The massive borrowing needed to fund the war effort left many nations in debt to the banking elite. This is why institutions like the IMF and World Bank were created after the war. They were designed to manage the global debt system and further centralize financial control in the hands of a few powerful families. In the Cold War between the Western capitalist powers and the Soviet Union, the bankers mastered the art of playing both sides of the fence. During the Cold War, it seemed like there was an intense ideological and political conflict between capitalism and communism. It seemed like a life or death struggle where only one system could survive, like the Highlander. And the system that did survive would dominate the world. But behind this surface level conflict, there was a different reality. Western capitalist elites were working with elites from the Soviet regime. There were a lot of connections between the Soviets and the West at that time. Even though the Soviets were against capitalism in public, they were deeply involved in the international financial system through organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. You think they're communist? American corporations like Ford were also doing business with the Soviets, and so were weapons manufacturers, oil companies, and of course banks. Without Western corporations sharing technology with the Soviets, their military would not have advanced nearly as far as it was able to. By financing and supporting both the capitalist West and the communist East, these elites could ensure that they would remain in control of the global financial system, regardless of which side won the ideological battle. Proving that when you have enough money, you can bet on both horses and always win. That's all I got. Be blessed. Bit boy out.